It is always such a delight to speak on behalf of the Fenimore Art Museum to share stories about Susan Fenimore Cooper. And so I want to thank especially Kevin for being such a wonderful host, but also the rest of the folks there at the Fenimore Art Museum and also at Fenimore Farm and Country Village for the great work that you are doing in New York State. I am coming at you today from Boise, Idaho. This is where I live. I teach nearby. And I am on the ancestral homelands of the Shoshone-Bannock peoples. I want to mention that because I want to acknowledge my gratitude for their care and dedication to this land over so many thousands of years. I also want to mention that because I'm going to call our attention today to the idea of time. So I'm going to launch a presentation here to share with you, and hopefully you are all seeing this, and then I will launch right in. Okay, so if you're not seeing that, or if there are any concerns, somehow let me know. Otherwise, I'm just going to assume that all is well. Okay, so I am going to ask us today to do a little bit of thinking about Susan Fenimore Cooper and the making of her environmental understanding in Europe with a particular focus on ideas of time. I'm especially interested in thinking about time because there's a really lively conversation going on right now concerning the nature of time. I'm having just an issue here with forwarding slides between Boise and New York, but it worked. So I'm entering a really lively conversation about how we conceptualize time today. And this conversation is occurring across so many disciplines. So I've selected just a few books, just a few titles to give you some sense of the reading that I've been doing and really benefiting from as I think about ideas of time and how they relate to the natural world. I've titled this slide, The Nature of Time, punning a little bit, because I want us to think about how we conceptualize time and what that has to do with our relationship with the natural world. And as I'll say, I think Susan Fenimore Cooper offers a really nice contribution along these same lines. So Jenny Odell, the first writer I feature there on the left, is an artist who's gone New York Times bestseller. She's writing about time in terms of how we attend, what we give attention to, what we spend our time attending to, and how we live in this productivity culture that wants to just eat all of our time and our attention. Then there's Marcia Bjornerud, who's a geologist. She has this beautiful book called Timefulness, How Thinking Like a Geologist Can Help Save the World. There's her thesis. But her essential argument is that we have forgotten the longevity of time. In fact, Bjornerud says, we've forgotten how the world is made by, indeed made of, time. We've forgotten the world is made of time in a real physical sense. Dipesh Chakrabarty is also writing from the historical perspective about notions of time in an age of climate challenge, and suggesting that this era of climate challenge really challenges us to be more critical about our understandings of time and our approach to history. And then finally, Margaret Ronda, I've listed here. She's a literary scholar who works with poetry and explores how poetry seems to be also disrupting our contemporary notions of time. So this lively conversation that I'm just sketching here for you essentially centers on how we conceptualize ourselves in time, how that relates to the physical environment, how our dominant cultural conceptions of time now really disrupt our attending to the natural world. It's not a natural thing for us to do, given our conceptions of time, and particularly attending to nature's particularities. So not nature writ large, but to the movements, changes, and adjustments that the physical world is having to make in this age of time as money, time as commodity, time as short. These thinkers want to remind us time is long. It's as long as the natural world, it's as long as the cosmos, as the planet, as nature. Our human lives are ephemeral and fleeting, but time is constant for all of natural life. And an awareness of that in our era of climate change really calls attention to the rates at which we are inflicting change and to the dangers of that. So that's the goal of most of these writers, is to highlight that for us in that way. I want to share with you a couple of images from Xavier Beau, who's a Spanish photographer who has created these remarkable photographs, a series he calls the ornithographies. And these photographs call our attention, they startle us to attention, to think about time, perception, and place. At least that's what I think about when I look at these Xavier Beau photographs and share them with my students. We all just marvel at them. It doesn't matter how many times we look at them. We see something new. But what I call attention to here is how Xavier Beau has made not just one image, but many, 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 many images. He's getting a lot of attention, so perhaps you're familiar with his work as well. But he makes many images over microseconds and then compiles them into one image. So what we see here is bird flight in and out of a tree over some period of time. And this disrupts our sense that this tree is a quiet tree. It doesn't see a whole lot of action. It doesn't maybe play a very big role in the natural world. And we see here this incredible flow of movement and a reminder that there's so much we don't perceive about what happens in the natural world. Here's another of Xavier Beau's photographs. And this is a quotation from him about himself. So he's referring to himself as the author here. He says, ornithographies arises from the author's concern for capturing those unnoticed moments and from the interest in questioning the limits of human perception. So Beau and these other writers I've mentioned want us thinking about what we're not perceiving in the moments that we don't quite have the capacity to perceive about the natural world. We're going to get to Susan Fenimore Cooper while thinking about these themes. So I've sort of laid them out here, three particular ideas that I want us to explore as we explore Susan Fenimore Cooper's time in Europe. The first is how we understand our relation to time. The second is how that understanding informs our experience of non-human nature. And then finally, third, how a single painting might inform an individual life. I want to take you on a little tour through a painting that meant an awful lot to Susan Fenimore Cooper. So here she is, Susan Fenimore Cooper, and in case some of you aren't familiar with her, I want to say just a little bit about her. Susan Fenimore Cooper was the daughter of James Fenimore Cooper and Susan Augusta Delancey Cooper. She lived from 1813 to 1894. And we associate her with Cooperstown, New York, the location of Fenimore Art Museum. I've marked Cooperstown here in Otsego County in New York State. Susan Fenimore Cooper lived in Cooperstown for the vast majority of her adult life. She also lived there as a very young child, in fact, on Fenimore Farm, where Fenimore Art Museum is now located. She's best known for her 1850 book, Rural Hours, which is a journal-like account of the natural and human communities of the Cooperstown area in 1850. She wrote it over the course of 2 years, made her nature observations and put them together into this account that really does read like a journal. Through the course of Rural Hours and in her other work as well, she wrote quite a bit more than just Rural Hours. These are some of the concerns that she brings to readers. She understood, even in 1850, that growing Euro-American settlements were bringing about huge changes to the landscape where she lived. One of them being the displacement of Native American peoples, the Oneida and the Mohawk in particular. She was also concerned about local and regional extinctions. She saw this in plants and mammals and in birds. She was concerned that as the native plant species disappeared, there was a proliferation of invasive plant species. And she always points to the difference between what's a native species and what's not native, and to how those non-native species, because they have no natural predators, are sort of taking over the native plants. She also was concerned about the reduction of edge-dwelling plant species, those plants that pop up on ecotones, we know. A profound concern of hers was sweeping deforestation. And we know that the deforestation was absolutely devastating to the landscapes of the Northeast in her time. She, in particular, points out changes in forest species composition and invasive plants, microclimate changes, how when you take down a forest, that microclimate has changes in its temperatures, fluctuating temperatures. There's less water holding capacity in soil when you take out trees, so more flooding and therefore falling water tables because of the less water that's there. So all of these were her concerns in rural hours and elsewhere. But again, because I realize some of you probably aren't familiar with rural hours, I want to share just a couple of examples of the kinds of things that she writes about, so you can have a brief flavor of her work in rural hours. I'll focus at first on a couple of days that are really close to today, May 1st, so that you know what she was seeing and thinking about. So on April 29th, 1848, she wrote about the tamaracks. She said the tamaracks are putting forth their bluish-green leaves. So she's interested here in color. I'll call your attention to that. That'll mean something in just a bit. To the tint of the leaves. She mentions the young cones on the tamaracks. They remind her of small strawberries by their color and form, she says. There's some more color, that red color. But they soon turn, she says, decidedly purple, the leaves, then green, and at last brown. So many of these trees are in her neighborhood, she observes. She compares the tamarack to the European larch on this particular day, April 29th, says that they're prone, the American tree is prone to becoming diseased and crooked, especially if they're transplanted, not so much when they're wild, and that even those crooked trees really add to the aesthetic beauty of the forest. She refers to their capricious, broken lines. She sometimes has really beautiful phrasing in her writing. So I want to call your attention there, in what I've just told you, to how even in that little daily entry, she's slowing down time, or inviting us to slow down time, by focusing on what's happening in a place, by attending to the colors and images of that place. The next day, May 1st, 2 days later, I guess, May 1st, she refers to a cloudy sky, says it's showery, not so bright as becomes a May day, she says. Sounds like you have a better day there in Cooperstown today than she did. She takes a walk anyway in the light sprinkling rain. She says she had to stick to the road. The woods were just too wet. And she notices the white cocoon along a meadow fence, a wildflower coming up, refers to its pure white petals, violets scattered by the roadside, the golden flowers of the marsh marigold, bright blossoms in a light, boggy spot, and the golden willows that are coming into leaf. And then she takes off on a comparison of the willows that grow in the United States and the willows that grow in Europe and elsewhere, and she offers a literary analysis of sorts of some biblical references to the willows of Babylon. May 3rd, my last example, pleasant walk on the open hillside, sweet, quiet day. She says there's no wind. She tells us the ferns are coming up. The wheat fields are very brilliant, she writes in their verdure. She comments on the golden green and a deeper shade of green, too, that she notices there. So as she's observing her natural surroundings, she's really engaging in a sort of phenological record, what's showing, what's what color now, but asking us again to think on time, how nature is birthing itself in that spring, unveiling itself across time with a particular focus on color and image. I want to shift now to one last passage from Rural Hours. It's not from May or anywhere near it. It's from November, but it's going to get us to the painting that I'd like to focus on really today. This is Susan Cooper's entry from Thursday, November 30th. Pleasant, she writes. Long walk in the bare open woods, neither heard nor saw a bird. She offers some lines of French verse that essentially say, the grove was without mystery, the nightingale was without voice, no bird in the grove. Then she says, the long yellow petals have fallen from the witch hazel. She offers some more thoughts on the witch hazel. And then this. The green wheat fields look vivid and bright, lying about the gray farms. The lake is deep blue, just now. It seems to be more deeply blue in the autumn than at any other season. Today it is many shades darker than the sky, almost as blue as the water in Guido's aurora. I've highlighted here on the slide some of her phrasing that I particularly want to attend to. Deep blue, more deeply blue, many shades darker than the sky, almost as blue as the water in Guido's aurora. The first time I read that entry, I looked up Guido's aurora and learned that it was a painting. There was that, educated myself. I had not known. But then I sat on it for a long time, wondering why on a November day is she thinking about Guido's aurora? That's a painting in Rome. She's in Cooperstown. She had been in Rome, but it had been a long time since she had been in Rome. I want to tell the story of why on a November day in 1848, 1849, Susan Cooper would call Guido's aurora to mind as she saw the color of the lake. So we're going to back up to when Susan Fenimore Cooper was a child. This is a picture of her, we think, when she was young, a drawing done by a French maid, we believe. And I've put Europe here in front of us to remind us that this is where she spent the majority of her coming of age. So James Fenimore Cooper and Susan Augusta Delancey Cooper took their 5 surviving children, 2 died as infants or near infants, took their 5 surviving children to Europe for a period of 7 years. And I'm going to flash through here their itinerary over the course of those 7 years and 5 months. But before I launch into that, I want to call attention to how old Susan was at this time. If you could take a kid to have a transformative experience, you would want to do it when they're about ages 13 to 20, right? Coming into awareness, coming into appreciation, and maturing, one hopes, right? I have a 17-year-old, it's happening, that's good. But maturing, an awareness of the world, an appreciation for things, and in the case of Susan Fenimore Cooper, a real interest in learning and watching and learning and listening. She was transformed by this trip. I wish I could share with you all of her European stories, but we'll focus on one that's really important, I think, to her environmental understanding. So I'm not going to read all these dates, but essentially they were at sea for a month in 1826, landed in England. After a short stay there, they headed to France. Now, I've put an asterisk next to France and a little note at the bottom of the slide to remind us that of these 7 years and 5 months, the Coopers, Susan in particular, spent 4.8 of those years in France, in Paris. So most of the time, the family lived in Paris. But they also took quite significant ventures, significant in terms of time and experience, to other places. The first of those was to Switzerland, where they spent most of the summer and early fall of 1828. And then they headed from Switzerland to Italy. They had a residence in Florence for several months, then in Sorrento, then in Rome, and then a briefer stay, about 10 days, in Venice. Susan Fenimore Cooper is 16 years old when they are in Sorrento in Rome, and I've highlighted those two lines in white because that's where we're going to focus our attention today. She had some very influential memories that occurred in Sorrento and in Rome that stayed with her and have some impact on that arbitrary, seemingly arbitrary reference to Guido Reni and the Aurora. I've included here a view of Sorrento, and if we had a very fine microscope, we could actually see the home where the Coopers lived there on the cliffs overlooking the Bay of Naples. They left Italy and headed to Germany, back to France for about a year, then ventured in Belgium and Germany, back to France for a little less than a year that time, Belgium, Germany, Switzerland, back to France, and then they headed home via England, where they spent a bit of time, and then they were at sea. And I should note that these dates I'm showing you are Susan Fenimore Cooper's dates. Her parents had slightly different travel plans. She was old enough that they could leave her with the younger kids and always a nanny or someone to help care for them, sometimes a teacher upstairs. This slide is to remind us that I will be touching on one little piece of her 7-year-plus journey in Europe. The Coopers were really energetic during their time in Europe. They saw ruins, famous landscapes, cathedrals, museums, cities, more ruins, castles. They filled their time in incredible ways with the riches of European history and European culture. Susan Cooper learned the languages of almost everywhere they traveled. The entire time she was there, she was studying and venturing with her family. Before I return us to Sorrento in Rome, I want to offer just a couple of examples of the ways in which her experience in Europe shaped her sense of herself in the world, and I think her sense in relation to the physical environment, the natural world. Just outside of Paris was La Grange, the home of the Marquis de Lafayette, as in General Lafayette. If you live in my house, you listen to the Hamilton soundtrack all the time, and anytime I say General Lafayette, all kinds of songs are in my head. But the Coopers spent time with General Lafayette and his family at his country home outside of Paris. They visited several times. And the reason I want to highlight this is because Susan Fenimore Cooper spent time in Europe with illustrious and established people, given her father's fame. She also spent time with people who were very aware of how young her nation was. The United States of America was born under General Lafayette and others, and so to spend time with him was to listen to her father and mother and the people who were there talk about revolution and what revolution means, the making of a new nation, what's happening with the new landscapes, cities popping up, populations booming, industry eventually rising. So Susan Cooper, at a very early age, has that sense of time in terms of nationhood in her nation's landscape, that this is a new, young place with a lot of future ahead of it, yet to be shaped, decisions that have important consequences. Another place they visited was in Switzerland, and I've highlighted just 4 or 5 days here when Susan accompanied her father and cousin and some guides on an excursion into the Bernese Oberland in Switzerland, And I've listed their itinerary here so that you can trace, if you'd like, where they were. They traveled by donkey and by foot. This was quite a venture for a teenager at that time to be trekking through the Alps, going village to village. And I call our attention to this to highlight the way in which Susan Fenimore Cooper was exposed to very old, wild landscapes, in addition to highly domesticated ones in Europe. And so she knew from a young age that contrast between the wilder places that are left more untouched and the more developed industrialized ones. She knew what happened when places were populated. And then finally, I'll call attention to her arts education, very relevant to her appreciation of the Aurora. Susan Fenimore Cooper, we know, had art education classes at the Louvre from none other than Samuel F.B. Morse, who was a painter, as you may know, before he became a famous inventor. And this is a commemorative painting of her time there. She's in the back corner, back left corner of this slide with her parents, supposedly having a lesson there. There are not a lot of Susan Fenimore Cooper's artworks that survive from this learning period in her life. A very small amount does, and most of that we're not even sure if it's hers. But we do know that she was in the gallery here and elsewhere. As I mentioned, they went to many museums and saw many great pieces of art, masterworks. So let's back up to Sorrento and to Rome. The family lived here in the Bay of Naples in Sorrento for that summer and had an incredible experience. The experience that they had here will inform her response later to the aurora. The family was here over the summer and into the early fall, and of all the places they went in Europe over those 7 years, Sorrento may have been their heaven. Susan Cooper referred to it many years later as dear, delightful Italy. She remembered many years later boating on the Bay of Naples with the family in the afternoon, bathing in its waters on hot afternoons after a morning spent studying while her father wrote. She remembered the wafting scent of orange blossoms from nearby groves and gardens. She remembered riding donkeys up the winding paths around Sorrento to visit ruins, strolling through hillsides and along sea cliffs. She had so many memories of this time. She especially remembered, as did her father, the unrivaled sunsets from their home, which had an incredible view, still does, of the bay, of the island of Capri. Their home was situated on the sea cliff, and just below the balustrade of their patio was a 150-foot drop to the water. Their terrace was 50 feet long, 25 feet wide, and they sat there every evening, taking in the glories of that gorgeous bay. They particularly paid attention to the color of the water. James Fenimore Cooper called the waters of the bay and the Mediterranean too blue for nature. That's a quote. They just seemed unreal. They were so blue. He said, "I know of no blue waters in all America," because James Fenimore Cooper couldn't imagine any waters in the United States that were as blue as these waters here. James Fenimore Cooper later wrote that he loved Italy so much he wished he could die there. And Susan Fenimore Cooper recalled these family times in Sorrento and in Italy as among the most special for her family. It just seemed an idyllic time. Some days the bay blazed sapphire blue or bright indigo. Other days it was sweet aquamarine, but the family noted its changing colors almost daily. Why this matters is that then they left Sorrento and they went to Rome. They saw a lot, did a lot while they were in Rome, but I'm going to focus on their visit to the Casino dell'Aurora, where they went to the Palazzo Pallavicini Rospigliosi and visited the palace itself, but also this casina, which is another name, casino, for a garden house, a summer house. So this palace was quite large, but the smaller building we're looking at here is the summer house that had been built on the property. The property was developed for the Roman cardinal, Scipione Borghese, and on the ceiling of that casino was painted Guido Reni's Aurora. Here I have the painting for you, kind of a lousy quality image of it. I'm going to show you better ones in just a minute here. But I want to give you some sense of the extreme, gorgeous display of color in this fresco on the ceiling of this summer house that she saw in Rome. This image shows you more of the ceiling itself, and you see these little side half circle panels. And I'll talk you through what we're looking at and what Susan would have known she was seeing in this painting. So on the sides are the zephyrs blowing wind, keeping things moving in the painting itself. The painting is called the Aurora because the woman to the far right in the front of the procession is Aurora herself. She's dawn, so she is leading the procession to bring dawn, morning, to the landscape below her. The zephyrs are on the sides. Apollo is there in the sun. I'm going to try to do a little circling of these characters as I talk about them. So here's Apollo, god of the sun, leading the steeds and driving the procession. Surrounding him are the Aurae, or the seasons, or the hours. I'll talk more about them in just a minute. The Puto here is the morning star. And then here we've got Aurora, dawn herself, bringing morning. Well, seeing this painting while in Europe was no unusual thing. Seeing Guido's Aurora was such a typical part of the American experience of the Grand Tour that lots of big names have written about the Aurora. Henry David Thoreau didn't see it in the flesh, but he wrote about it. Washington Irving saw it and wrote about it. So did Herman Melville. These people commenting on the astounding color of the painting and on its particularly moving quality. It was experienced in the 19th century as poetry itself. Nathaniel Hawthorne was so taken by the painting that Sophia Hawthorne had the outlines of it engraved on their pine bedstead, painted on their pine bedstead once they were home. So seeing it was not unusual. The Coopers would have just been doing what American tourists do in Rome when they went to see the Aurora. But like other American tourists, they were absolutely taken by it. This here is a picture of a 19th century pendant of the Aurora. You could, I guess, go to the gift shop and buy a pendant or a Rome bracelet. This is a micro mosaic showing the Aurora and Rome so that you could remember where you were in your grand tour when you saw the Aurora. Again, a very popular painting in the American imagination and in the history of European art. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about what we're seeing here and about the iconography of the painting, what it would have meant more fully to the Coopers and what it has come to mean to Susan over time. So Aurora, there to the right, the dawn, she's the bringer of the sun, the bringer of light, the bringer of day. She's a symbol of rebirth and renewal, of time as a continual journey. That's key. And her tears, which you can't see in this painting, but in the mythology, her tears are said to be the source of the morning dew, which I think is just lovely. Apollo, who is driving the chariot, Helios, Phoebus, other names for Apollo, he's driving the solar chariot, and we notice that he's so used to this role, the horses are so used to this route that he can do it one hand with a rather slack reins. We all know where we're going in this painting, and Aurora is leading very effectively. The hours, or the Aurae, they're the goddesses who set the rhythm of human activity in the mythology. They represent the seasons. They represent the hours. Cycles of time are represented by these women who are circling Apollo. I find it very telling that when Susan Fenimore Cooper named her book, she named it Rural Hours, thinking about these cycles of time. The cherub up at the top there, the Puto, represents twilight. He's carrying the morning star, Venus. We also know him as Phosphorus, as Eosphorus. He's the bringer of dawn, sort of lighting the way, although Aurora's out in front doing her job as strong women do. I want to call attention to the motion of this whole painting and to how Rennie captured that motion in the moving arms and moving legs, feet poised in movement, the hands that are grasping as if wanting to hold on to one another, the folds of the dresses and robes, the clouds that they're breaking as they go here that show kind of pressure against their movement, and then Aurora's tremendous robes and dress behind her also showing the action. Finally, let's focus on the lower right-hand corner, on the land and the sea that is pictured down here. That land, that blue, blue sea, is the grounds of all the movement that happens here. That landscape and the sea beyond, where there are some sailboats, although I doubt you can see them, they place this scene. The passage of flight would be meaningless without something to pass over. We experience time, this painting suggests, through place. John Constable noted the immense importance of the landscape in this painting as an accessory to the story that's told here. He said, though Guido has placed us in the heavens with the train, the procession, we are looking towards the earth, where seas and mountaintops are receiving the first beams of the morning sun. Aurora scatters flowers onto the landscape, Constable says, and the landscape, instead of diminishing the illusion, is the chief means of producing it, totally essential to the story. This painting serves to render time as constant, but as relevant only through place, as rooted in place, which seems essential. Well, Susan Cooper took all these memories with her, but the Coopers also took with them, when they left France, returned to England, and came back to the United States of America, a copy of the Aurora. James Fenimore Cooper, as you may know, had a copy commissioned, and it was painted by the same painter who painted this painting now showing, the Bay of Naples, John Gadsby Chapman. I want to stop and pause just for a quick minute to say that the work of recovering Susan Fenimore Cooper's life has meant reading her work, reading her letters, searching through many, many archives for any hint of where she spent her time, how, and why. But I somehow never expected that a painting would tell me as much as Guido's Aurora did. Here's the Aurora now. This is the Cooper's copy of the Aurora, which hangs at Hyde Hall State Historic Site. You can go see it. I assume it's still hanging. It was the last time that I was in town there, in Cooperstown. Hyde Hall State Historic Site is at the north end of the lake. This painting shows the wear and tear of the years, which I think enriches its value because it's telling us the story of travel and of being in a family for so many decades. Just going to flip through some pictures here of it so that you can get some close-ups. There, Aurora, we can see her holding the wildflowers that she supposedly strews over the landscape beneath her as she brings morning. This painting has faded over time, and so the landscape is more of a blur at this point, but that blue sea that the Coopers remembered and celebrated is still there, very, very clear. And thanks to Richard Walker for taking these photographs at my request. This is amazing. I had spent a lot of time in the Fenimore Art Museum library, and after learning about the Aurora and realizing that the Coopers had a copy of it in their home, I remembered this photograph. Now, this is a copy of the photograph. It's not great quality. It isn't even in its original, but this image, I should say, is of the Cooper women in their living room. And lo and behold, there is the Aurora hanging on the wall. You can barely see it above the couch in the back, but maybe you can make out the aura as they're circling Apollo here, and here's Aurora in flight. Discovering this photograph was so special because it told me that Susan Fenimore Cooper was not just arbitrarily mentioning Guido Reni's Aurora in her Rural Hours passage, but she was sitting in her parlor doing her writing, struggling at how to name the shade of blue of the lake. I imagine her looking up at the painting, seeing that remarkable blue in the painting, and saying, almost as blue as Guido's Aurora. So these references to deep blue, more deeply blue, many shades darker than the sky, almost as blue, these references are not merely to a painting far away that she had seen at that point nearly 30, 20, 25 years before, but they're references to family time, to the memory of the best family time that she could conceive of in her memory of her childhood family. Just beautiful. So we've thought a little bit about how we understand our relation to time through Susan Cooper, through art, how her understanding informed her experience of non-human nature by attending to particulars, and how a single painting might inform an individual life. Before I conclude, I want to call attention to another experiment in time that focuses on rural hours, and that is the brand new, recently launched, just about a week old, fantastic project that Will Walker, the Cooperstown Village historian and professor in the Museum Studies program there in Cooperstown, has started. It's on Substack. If you're familiar with Substack, it's kind of a blog posting or writing posting site, and you can subscribe if you have not already to Will Walker's Rural Hours project. What Will is doing is taking day by day the entries of Rural Hours, including passages from them that focus on what's happening in the natural environment when Susan Cooper was writing, and then doing some reflection on what he's seeing today on his walks and runs in the similar landscape. I love how Will is looking back at history and also at the present through this project, asking us to focus on particulars, disrupting our tendency to just fly through time. Well, the Aurora was 200 years old when Susan Fenimore Cooper saw it, and we are coming up on 200 years since she saw the Aurora. What lessons might we draw? One, I think, is the importance of the arts in teaching us how we might live. We never know how a painting is going to inform our understanding of how to live in time, what to attend to, what colors we might notice. I imagine that painting helped Cooper, Susan Fenimore Cooper, nurture her attention to temporality, to the ephemeral nature of human life amid nature's endless progression of days and seasons that was so precious and that she grew increasingly concerned about. I'm showing you here a painting that hung in my daughter's nursery when she was a baby. I wanted to fill her world with colors. And so this is just a cheap canvas that I bought because it was going to be in a little kid's room. But when she was small, we would sit at the painting every night at bedtime, and I would point to the colors and name them. And I would try to teach her creative words as I did it. So I might say indigo or sapphire or Ceylon or ultramarine or aquamarine for the blues. I didn't realize that as I was doing that, I wasn't just teaching her words. I wasn't just filling her world with colors. But maybe, if I was lucky, I was also giving her memories of family that rooted her to place, that rooted her to the particularities of color and shape in our world around us.